Well, hello, Andrew here again, and today is episode 62. And we're up to Matthew 14, verses 20 to 23. We have just come through the feeding of the 5,000 plus, and so we pick up the narrative right at the end. I just wanted to pick up a few verses between this and what happens next. Verse 20, all ate and were filled, and they took up what was left over of the broken pieces, 12 baskets full. And those who ate were about 5,000 men, beside women and children. Immediately Jesus made the disciples get into the boat and go on ahead to the other side while he dismissed the crowds. And after he dismissed the crowds, he went up the mountainside by himself to pray. When evening came, he was there alone. So, we remember how Jesus came to be here. He was looking initially for a quiet place. He had just heard that John the Baptist had been executed by Herod Antipas, and it meant a whole lot of things for him, and he needed to be able to attend to this. And so he climbs in the boat and off he goes, and he comes to this alone place and discovers that the crowd has got there before him, and there are more and more people pouring in all the time as they've been running around the shores to be with Jesus. And his response is to have compassion on them. And so he heals all their sick and he ministers with them. And then at the end, he's coming towards them, probably well into the afternoon, and he says, well, he can't send them away hungry. And so the feeding, let's call it that, happens, where all they have, all Jesus and his 12 disciples have, is 2 fish and 5 small loaves. And Jesus takes them and he looks up to heaven, he gives thanks, he blesses God, and he starts to break, and everybody gets fed, and they have 12 basketfuls left over. And so that story comes to a graceful end. And now there is a kind of me time for Jesus. And we read that he made his disciples get into the boat. And there's a sense of strong persuasion and force involved in this. And you could imagine their objectives, but what about you? How come we're leaving you behind? I'll be fine. No, you've got to come with us. No. Just get in the boat and go. And you could imagine the story unfolding. And there is an element of confusion for them. They don't understand how Jesus can be wanting to be alone and sending them off on their own, and he's still left with the crowd. But they do as they're told, and they sail away. And then Jesus dismisses the crowd. And I wonder how many still wanted to hang on, but he is obviously persuasive there in a kind and gentle way, and they too eventually just leave. And Jesus is alone. He's able to breathe. And we read that he goes up the mountain to pray. And it's in this place I want to suggest that Jesus is able to unburden. He's able to talk with the Father about how he feels about the loss of John the Baptist, how he feels about what this means for him, and the sense of him now actually becoming front and centre and having to take up the task more fully to which he has been called, and the burden of the ministry which is in front of him. And yet my hunch is that the Father's response, and we'll talk about how this interplay goes in a few moments, but yet my hunch is that the Father's response will include what has just happened, and that this remarkable event, however we want to describe it, is something that God was doing, the crowd have fed, and that Jesus has received in this the affirmation of the Father, and a quiet underpinning sense that all will be well. And those wonderful words of Julian of Knowledge, that all will be well, all things will be well, all manner of things will be well. And there's this quiet affirmation for Jesus. You just keep going. You just keep putting yourself in my way. You just keep responding as you know I'd have you do, and everything will be okay. Let it unfold. And I would imagine for Jesus there is a whole lot of gratitude that flows just for what has happened. And I can imagine him sitting there with a sense of companionship with the Father, just with a big smile on his face, thinking, wow, that was amazing. And it may have exceeded his own expectations, but it was amazing. And he has just such a deep sense of appreciation and warmth and of love for the Father. I want to talk now about prayer, about what I experience as, and I'm going to project onto Jesus, although his would have been in fuller measure, this kind of prayer, this conversational kind of prayer. It's where I talk and where God listens, and where God talks and where I listen. And I grew up in an environment where people would talk about talking to God and about hearing from the Lord, hearing the voice of the Lord. And I struggled for a long time to understand what that was about. And I was talking about this earlier on a call earlier this week with a friend, and we'd had very similar experiences. And the thing for me is that it was probably 25 years ago. I was in conversation with another leader, and I said to her, okay, so you talk about hearing from the Lord. What does the Lord sound like? And she said, he sounds just like me, but he isn't. It's just like me, but it's different. And I discovered, in fact, that's what it is. That the Lord's voice sounds a lot like my voice. Sometimes I can think I'm simply talking to myself, and yet I'm not. It's something much, much more. It sounds like me, but isn't. I remember, of course, you might be thinking, well, that's very dangerous, Andrew. That sounds like some forms of schizophrenia. And in fact, it is something we need to be aware of. I remember when I lived in Dunedin that I was part of a Methodist fellowship there, and I got on very well with the minister. And there was a young man in the congregation that had been part of our life for a while, and I hadn't seen him for a few weeks. And so I asked the minister, so I haven't seen so-and-so, where is he? Do you know where he is? He says, yes. He said, he's in, I think it was Ward 8 of Wakuri Hospital, which is the acute admissions ward of the hospital, the psychiatric ward. And I said, so what's he doing there? And he said to me, he said that God was talking to him. I says, okay. I says, so how do you know that God wasn't talking to him? And these words were forever in my head. He said, I asked him what God said. And he knew, simply on the basis of what this young man was claiming God was saying to him, that this was not God. And I think that's it. It's a question of discernment. Because what I've discovered is that the God that I hear is much smarter than I am. Much, much wiser than I am. Much more generous than I am. Much more forgiving than I am. Much more compassionate than I am. Much more gentle than I am. And believes in me much more than I believe in myself. I've discovered this, and when I've learnt to say, okay, so I've got questions, and I will bring the questions, and the answers usually come very quickly. And that's what I say to people. This friend I was talking to earlier in the week says, well, he encourages people to expect the answer to evolve over time, to just become clear. And when my experience is, in fact, it's often the first thing that pops into my head. So if I have a question and I say, Lord, I'm struggling with this, and say what it is, often there's something that'll pop straight into my head. It'll be just there immediately. Have you thought of? Try. And often the immediate responses think that's ridiculous, you know? And I think that's why we don't notice, because we think, no, it couldn't be that. Couldn't be that simple. No, that it wouldn't be that. And yet again and again I found actually it is that. It is that. It just needs to be sat with for a little while. So, okay. Now, I'm not saying it always works that way. There's a measure of discernment that's involved. And it comes out of this God who actually desires the very best for you, for me, that God's purposes. It's that which leads to life. As I come back to that Rob Bell mantra, I only do that which leads to life, that which is life-giving. It leads in that direction. And so once I clicked onto this, I became aware that God has been speaking to me through all my life. I just didn't notice. And I could look back at significant events where a voice that sounded like me but wasn't me was just quietly encouraging me, and where things would just pop into my head that sounded like me but wasn't me, and which I actually didn't take a lot of notice of. But looking back, realised how wise and how generous and how life-giving they were. Sometimes, even though they were asking, the ask was something that was difficult, something I really would rather not have heard, but no, I needed to. And so I just want to offer that to you. I sort of have this sense of this conversational relationship where Jesus gets the space with him and the Father, and they talk about where things are up to, and there has this sense of an internal dialogue which is back and forth, and Jesus is aware of just how loved he is and how safe he is. And I want to suggest that this is available to all of us, is that God's desire to speak to you is greater than your desire to hear from him. So, we'll leave it there for now. Okay. If you've got any questions, post them. Can't promise that I'll give you a satisfactory answer, but I'll do my best. Okay. God bless you all.